John, thank you for being here at ReEngage. I truly appreciate you guys and the effort you're putting into your marriage. Today we're going to talk about a subject, and I'm just going to entitle it Emotional Intimacy. But the problem is, I think, that for maybe, I don't want to talk too much to the guys here because I know that, we kind of get stereotyped a little bit. But guys, did you know that there are different types of intimacy or different categories of intimacy? Men typically, when we hear the word intimacy, we just go straight to thinking about sexuality. And funny that when women hear the term intimacy, they typically go to the spot of defining intimacy as that emotional connection. But intimacy can be all kinds of categories or different ways to look at it. There's emotional, there's intellectual, there's physical, maybe even experiential intimacy, spiritual intimacy when we connect worshiping God together. But whatever we define intimacy as, so here's the truth, that you and your spouse both desire intimacy. But the kind of intimacy that your radar may be scanning the world for, searching for, may be different than what your spouse is looking for. And so I shared this concept the other night with my wife and said that, it's funny how my wife, I think her radar would be scanning the world for that emotional and experiential intimacy, and my radar would be scanning for the sexual intimacy. And so when I shared that idea with her, she said, it's not like my radar is constantly on looking for that, but when those things happen, it's like it's a blip on the radar. It really means a lot to me. And so when I say scanning, it doesn't mean we're constantly in need of looking for that, but man, there's just something wired inside of us that needs that connection. So I want to define intimacy first. And intimacy, I believe, is to fully know and be fully known without the fear of rejection. To fully know and be fully known without the fear of rejection. We both want this, again, we both need this, but we might have different expressions of what that looks like. And so we're on this journey then to know what is our spouse's need for intimacy, and maybe be in touch with what I need and being able to communicate that. And so another truth then, if that's what we're looking for, to be fully known and to fully know someone else, is that we have to work to maintain intimacy in our marriage. It doesn't just happen. I think that's kind of a Hollywood myth or this misnomer that if we really love someone, things are just going to happen. We don't have to put any work into it. If it's truly love, it looks like this. But my experience has been that that's not reality, that we have to do a little work to make sure that intimacy is maintained in our relationship. Because we get busy, life gets going, there's all kinds of stuff happening. It's easy to forget and neglect those type of things. But when my experience tells me in my own relationship and working with others that when intimacy is diminished, when intimacy is down, there's a few things that aren't so positive that typically kind of happen when intimacy is diminished. There's distancing that takes place emotionally, physically, intellectually, that we start to feel apart from each other. Sometimes when we don't feel that connection, there might even be withholding physically, intellectually, emotionally. There's a little fear that comes in because we think if I put out this desire for intimacy and it gets rejected, then that hurts me and I don't want to get hurt. When intimacy is not present, there can tend to be hurt and a little pain there because I'm not feeling that value that I want to feel. We can tend to isolate a little bit to protect ourselves or to say, I'm just not going to go back there again. And then in really tough situations, we might even start to look to outward sources to get that intimacy instead of seeking that within our relationship that God has given us. So I believe that cultivating intimacy in your marriage and my marriage is massively important, and it's something that we've got to work on. And so if we know that's the truth, that we're both looking for different ways maybe of how intimacy is expressed, but intimacy is so vital. So my challenge for all of us then is let's get to work and make sure that intimacy is happening in our marriages. One of the things that's interesting is that all of us are hardwired for that need for intimacy. We're born with that. There was a study that was done a few years ago, and it was really interesting. They had a baby, and they kind of looked at the emotional responses of this baby when it didn't feel like it had that intimate connection. And so they documented kind of typical responses that a baby has when it feels a little rejected. So it's a tough experiment to watch. And then they go to a couple, And there's kind of this bid, this idea, hey, I want intimacy just like the baby did. And they kind of look at the responses of that couple, and they tend to mirror exactly what that baby did. And so the therapist, the psychologist that came out of this said, hey, we're all hardwired for intimate connection. We're hardwired to need this and be connected with another human being. And what doesn't happen, there's typical responses that take place. And so it's like we're all like these mammals that just, this is how we respond when intimacy doesn't take place in our lives. And so we're hardwired for this. I believe Scripture even talks about how God wired us for that need, for that connection, not only with our spouses, but with Him. It says in Psalms, it says, you made all the delicate inner parts of my body and knit me together in my mother's womb. Thank you for making me so wonderfully complex. Your workmanship is marvelous. How well I know it. I believe the fall of humanity, when original sin entered the world, it caused us to be disconnected from our true source of intimacy, which is God. And so we've been on this journey of looking for it ever since. And so when we have this true understanding of God and intimacy, it looks like this, that God knows us intimately, that God cares for us intimately and loves us intimately. And this is the truth that we must continually look to believe and understand about ourselves. And so even when God created the Godhead, the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, there's this intimate connection that's there. So it's kind of, even from the creation of the world, even in God Himself, there's this desire for intimacy. And so one of the things that I think as we talk about re-engaging and re-engage here is that we must re-engage with our true source of intimacy, which is God. And that's our first and foremost desire, is to be connected with Him, because that's the truest source of intimacy. But I think what happened then is God gave us marriage to be like a shadow or a type to say to us that there's also a connection that we have to follow, and that can be found in marriage. And so we're kind of in response to our spouses showing this is what God is like for us, because we want to be known, we want to be cared for, we want to be loved unconditionally. So if this is so needed, intimacy, and so desired by all of us, why is it so difficult to achieve? So one of the things, like we said earlier, it may be that we just have different goals of what intimacy looks like. It's almost like we could be two ships passing in the night and kind of saying, here's what I'm looking for in intimacy, here's what I'm looking for, and they don't meet, so we feel frustrated and hurt. And I think the other thing is intimacy is kind of this vulnerable place. And so when we give a bid, like how I'd like to have intimacy, and it makes us a little vulnerable to attack, to ridicule, to rejection, to not feeling in control, to not feeling protected. So sometimes we shy away from expressing our needs for intimacy or pursuing intimacy because we don't want to get hurt. So when I was a kid, real or perceived, I felt like I was rejected a lot. My parents were divorced. I grew up in a very blue-collar town, but really was into things that I wasn't in all the things that my friends were into, so I kind of felt like this outsider all the time. Again, some of that was real, some of that was perceived. For all of us is that way. And so therefore, I kind of learned to structure my world where I was in control, and I was never the one that could be vulnerable or to be hurt because I protected myself. I would push away friends. I would even push away later in my dating life girlfriends at any sign of not looking like I was in control. And so that influence, that baggage had a lot of bearing on my ability to give and receive intimacy. So the point in sharing that is that our past, unfortunately, has a lot of power over our present and a lot of power over our present intimacy needs. And so that can be a barrier of why intimacy is so difficult for us, because there's a lot in our past that maybe even prevents us from being in that spot. And so what happens then is, like, because of my issues, my wife would kind of have her own intimacy needs. And if I felt like I was vulnerable, I would push those things away because I'd built up these beliefs and these protections. But so she would start to feel kind of not intimate, rejected by me a little bit. And so when we build those walls up, even if they're unintentional walls in our relationships, it obviously hurts us and it hurts the people we're in a relationship with. So what we have to get to is, again, understanding what true emotional intimacy looks like. And it says that I'm safe here. I am cherished here. And these are all things that God says about us and things that we want our spouse to feel from us. I'm valued here, I'm appreciated here, and I'm admired here. And that's beautiful intimacy, and that's what we want. That's the atmosphere we want to create in our marriages. I'm safe, I'm cherished, valued, I'm appreciated, I'm admired. So the first key for us to really begin to move into true emotional intimacy, which I believe we're hardwired to need, is to help your partner feel those things. So the question is, how are we doing in those areas of making them feel that way? How are you doing? How am I doing to make my partner feel those things? Safe, cherished, valued, appreciated, admired. And so if there's a deficiency there, if we would grade ourselves and I'm not doing very well, that's probably where we need to start in looking at intimacy. So the things we need to do then in cultivating those things, that place of vulnerability and connection, it looks like this. Here's how we cultivate those things. We might need to go back and address those hurts and pains from our childhood, from our experiences, from where we've built up walls, and realize that maybe there's something hindering us from allowing that really to take place because we're self-protecting. We need to make sure that when it comes to our spouse, we're hearing their dreams, we're hearing their desires, we're hearing their hopes, we're hearing their hurts. There's a place where they can share. We need to make sure we're sharing our dreams, our hopes, desires, and hurts. And ultimately, our actions speak very loud. They speak louder than words. And how are we showing them true intimacy? So, again, just like always with ReEngage, I think the best place we need to start is to draw a circle around ourselves and saying, what can I do to make sure my spouse feels intimate with me, or they feel those things? So we've got to do some work on our intimacy, comfortability in our lives. You're not going to be perfect. It's impossible. You're human. You have experience. You have life. But we must ask the question, what might be hindering my ability to be vulnerable through intimacy? We've got to know the answer to that question. What are some things that might be hindering me? So counseling, regeneration, doing some work on our souls, doing some work on a reconnection with our Creator, those are healthy, wonderful, beautiful places for you and I to all start to make sure that we're at a spot where we can live in intimacy. Healthy people go on this journey of figuring out that question because we need to understand that our spouse needs intimacy, we need intimacy, and we might be the barrier for that at times. Give your relationship with your spouse some attention. Become a student of your spouse. It just doesn't magically happen. This idea of just understanding what their intimate needs are without asking questions, without studying them, is just a farce. It's not true. Intimacy takes work, like we've talked about. And so some of that work might look, a few practical ideas that you might want to think about in this next week as you go through this journey is, I love the 20-minute rule. The 20-minute rule means that I'm going to spend about 20 minutes pretty consistently with my spouse, just in uninterrupted conversation. Phones are off, TV's off. We're just alone together, having conversations, learning about the inner world of that other person. And for us, drawing that circle, we're working on our listening skills. We're making sure they're feeling heard. Because when people feel heard, they feel valued. When they feel valued, they start to feel intimate. So work on yourself. If you have a hard time sharing emotionally, we'll get in touch. Why is this hard for me to be intimate and share emotionally what's going on with me? Another beautiful way to find intimacies I've seen a lot with couples is praying together. Just simply holding hands and asking God to be in the midst of our relationship. If it feels awkward, it feels weird, just push through. That's a good thing to do. We've talked a lot about building a love map. Get to know what their intimacy needs are. Again, we're not so much focused on our needs as we're giving. They're going to feel intimacy. It's going to come back to us. But asking them the question, what are your intimacy needs? Stick with ReEngage. Stick with a process like this, something similar to this. Stick with the process of continually working on your marriage and being reminded how important intimacy is. Another thing you might do is, it's very popular, take the love language assessment. I think it's just 5lovelanguages.com. Take that assessment and learn what it means to love the person the way they need to feel loved. And the last thing I would encourage us to do when it comes to intimacy is people enjoy when they feel appreciated. That leads to intimacy. So find ways to say, or to notice things that your spouse does well, or things that you appreciate about them. And don't keep them internal, but say them. Let them know how much you appreciate them. Let them know how much you care. So as we go on this journey, I believe that that's going to create this atmosphere of emotional intimacy. And when that atmosphere of emotional intimacy is there, great, beautiful things can happen. And again, it's our job to say, how am I creating that atmosphere for my spouse? and to be on that journey of connecting with them and connecting with God. Thanks for your time.